Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
All right. Welcome to Gettysburg National Military Park. On behalf of my colleagues here, we're all very glad that you're here today for our winter lecture series. My name is Dan Vermilya. I'm sure for many of you, you might not recognize me. This is my first time doing a winter lecture here. Just a brief intro on who I am. I've been in the Park Service for a couple years now. I've worked at Antietam Battlefield in Maryland for a couple years, and last year I had the privilege of working here as a seasonal ranger during the summer season, and I was fortunate enough to be asked to take part in this program today. And of course our topic today is in keeping with the theme of 1864, or the Civil War in 1864. It is the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. Now, by a show of hands, I am curious to see how many of you have visited Kennesaw Mountain National Battlefield Park. Okay. It is about 25 miles northwest of Atlanta. It's probably the biggest green space near Atlanta, so it gets quite a few visitors. I think the statistic is something like near 2 million visitors a year, but the vast majority of those visitors go there for the recreation, for the trails, things like that. So a lot of the visitors go to Kennesaw, don't really pick up on the history of the park. It's an interesting story to tell, a fascinating part of the war in 1864. And some of you might ask yourselves, what does a ranger who has worked at Antietam National Battlefield and Gettysburg National Military Park know about a battle that took place many miles away in Georgia? It's a valid question. Well, let's see if we can get this going here. It'd help if I turned it on. Okay. This is a very familiar image, no doubt. The image of Atlanta burning in 1864. It's one of the most famous moments of the American Civil War. We have front and center William Tecumseh Sherman riding victoriously. He's on his way, starting his famous March to the Sea. Well, the fall of Atlanta, I would say, is one of the three most important Union victories of the American Civil War. In conforming with what we might call the central storyline of the war, one of the central legacies of the war, which is the expansion of freedom in the United States. And I would say those three victories are Antietam in 1862, the victory that led to the Emancipation Proclamation being issued. Then in July of 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation and that new birth of freedom that Lincoln was fighting for needed to be defended, it was defended at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. And then finally, the fall of Atlanta in September 1864 was the victory which many historians agree helped to ensure the re-election of Abraham Lincoln, therefore helping to make possible things such as the 13th Amendment. So it's all connected in the broad scope of the Civil War. And as far as the Atlanta campaign goes, a lot of times it gets forgotten. A lot of folks focus on the March to the Sea as Sherman's big triumph. But without the Atlanta campaign, there would not have been the March to the Sea. There would not have been this opportunity to cut south through Georgia. He had to get into Georgia first. And that is the story of the Atlanta campaign. Of course, here just to do some background, some setup. I know this is Western theater stuff, and for some folks it might be kind of unfamiliar, so we're going to start from a broad background, get caught up to speed. At the end of 1863, Union forces had made tremendous gains in the Western theater. Most of Tennessee had fallen to Union forces. Notably, late 1863, you have Confederate victory at Chickamauga in northern Georgia, and then in November of 1863, Union forces have a victory at Chattanooga, driving away Confederate forces under General Braxton Bragg. These victories mean that the summer campaigns, or the main fighting campaigns of 1864, as far as the Western theater, are likely going to be taking place not in Tennessee, but in the state of Georgia. At the end of 1863, we have some leadership changes for the Union Army. We have this fellow here, no doubt a famous face, Ulysses S. Grant. In early 1864, becomes Lieutenant General commanding all Union forces in the Civil War. Leading a void of leadership in the West, this newly created military division of the Mississippi, this broad command encompassing the Western theater, William Tecumseh Sherman assumes command of that force, that position. And these two men are in many ways unlikely candidates to be in these positions in 1864, considering where they were earlier on in their lives and their careers. Each one had experienced numerous failures in their personal, professional, military lives. They have a strong friendship going back to what many might say the Battle of Shiloh in 1862. So in 1864, you will have for the first time concerted action for Union forces, a strong friendship binding together actions in the East and the West, with Grant acting in the East, commanding all Union forces, and Sherman acting in the West. On the other hand, Confederate leadership. I think I may have heard a few chuckles right there, and that says it all right there. That's a great transition. Thank you for doing that. While we could use the word strong to characterize the partnership and the ties for Union leadership at the start of 1864, we cannot use that word for Confederates. Braxton Bragg. He is certainly not the most popular commander of the war. That might be the understatement of the afternoon. He is not loved by his subordinate generals, but he has a very powerful ally in Richmond, Jefferson Davis. It allows him to keep his command throughout much of 1863. But after he loses Chattanooga, Bragg is essentially relieved of his command and brought to Richmond to serve as Davis's new military advisor, a role he will hold in 1864. Meaning that Joseph Johnston, a man who Davis does not like, these two men do not get along. Joseph Johnston is placed in command of what is the Confederate Army of Tennessee. And note my wording there very carefully. Army of Tennessee, the state of Tennessee. You'll understand the importance of that in just a moment. So these will be some of the leading figures for the Confederate side in 1864. In these campaigns, you will have concerted action. They will be plunging deep into the heart of the Confederacy. The two main campaigns will be Grant and the Army of the Potomac, moving against Robert E. Lee in Virginia in what is known as the Overland Campaign. And in the West, you will have William Tecumseh Sherman, with his Army Group, as we can call it, moving against Joseph Johnston, the Confederate Army of Tennessee, trying to damage Confederate war resources in Georgia. Each campaign will prevent Confederate armies from reinforcing one another. Very important. For Sherman, looking at his campaign into Georgia in 1864, there were some major problems. Throughout much of the fighting in the West, we're talking about vast expanses of territory. And there's a need to move men and supplies across these expanses of ground. And rivers are a key way to do that. But Sherman has a problem. There are no rivers that will follow his route of advance towards Atlanta. There is instead a railroad. A railroad. This will serve as his primary means of moving south into Georgia. It's going to be his main supply line, the Western and Atlantic Railroad. Sherman's Army Group is going to be composed of essentially three different forces. And earlier I said, note my wording when I said the Confederate Army of Tennessee, because if it's not confusing enough, we have a Union Army of the Tennessee, named after the Tennessee River. And that's going to be commanded by James McPherson, not the historian, the General James McPherson. James Birdseye McPherson, an Ohio native, just like Sherman himself. The Army of the Cumberland, happy looking fella right here, George Henry Thomas, native Virginian, stays loyal to the Union. He's a general who we often forget about when we're talking about these great men of the Western theater. We often talk about names such as Bragg or Albert Sidney Johnston or Grant or Sherman, and Thomas is sometimes forgotten about. And last but not least, we have the Army of the Ohio, commanded by John Schofield. And at the start of the campaign, these forces are going to number about 100,000 total. For Confederates, Johnston's Army of Tennessee at the start of the campaign is going to number perhaps 60,000 effective soldiers in May. And he's going to have three Army Corps. He's going to have William Hardee, Leonidas Polk, is pictured here. And no doubt a name familiar to many folks who've spent time on the Gettysburg battlefield, John Bell Hood. He is now in the West in 1864. And again, the campaign goals for each of these men squaring off. For Sherman, it's to move south, pursue Joseph Johnston, damage Confederate war resources in Georgia. For Johnston, it's a much different scenario. He is being pressured by Jefferson Davis in Richmond to launch his own campaign against Sherman, but he doesn't believe he has enough men or materiel or resources to do that. What he essentially wants to do is wait in Georgia, find some good defensive ground, force Sherman to attack him, and then launch his counteroffensive into Georgia. In early May, on May 5th, May 6th of 1864, these two armies, separated by hundreds of miles, these two Union armies begin moving. And again, concerted military action. No doubt many of you are familiar with the Battle of the Wilderness in Virginia, Well, at the same time that is going on, Sherman begins his push south into Georgia. However, instead of a dense forest, he's dealing with mountains. Johnston has taken up position on Rocky Face Ridge, some mountainous ground near Dalton, Georgia, which poses some major problems for Sherman and his army. And it's going to start a pattern in this campaign, a pattern of flanking and maneuvering around Johnston's army. This is Sherman's preferred route of advance. He's going to send the Army of the Tennessee to do an end around Johnston's army, forcing him to fall back from Dalton to Resaca, where on May 14th and 15th, while the fighting is going on at Spotsylvania in Virginia, the Battle of Resaca, the first battle of the Atlanta campaign, is fought in Georgia. There's a few thousand casualties there. Certainly it pales in comparison when we're thinking about the bloodshed of places like the Mule Shoe at Spotsylvania, some of the things that are very familiar for us here who are students of the war in the Eastern Theater. But nonetheless, it is a significant action, especially when considering that Sherman is going to repeat his method of advance, continue to try to outflank Johnston at every turn during this campaign. By late May, several weeks into the campaign, these two armies have centered in a place known as the Hellhole of Georgia. Essentially, Sherman had been advancing along the Western and Atlantic Railroad. By late May, he decides he's going to try to completely outflank Johnston, leave the railroad altogether. The two armies become bogged down in a very dense forested area near Dallas, Georgia. Three very vicious battles are fought. The Battle of New Hope Church, Pickett's Mill, and Dallas. Three quick successive fights, these two armies trying to block each other or fight each other at every possibility. Johnston swinging out and blocking Sherman's flanking advance. What this means for our story for Kennesaw Mountain is that as June begins, Sherman has to shift back to the railroad and continue advancing towards Marietta, Georgia. And I hope you can all see this, but right here, Kennesaw Mountain is located just west of Marietta, Georgia. It's some mountainous terrain west of Marietta. Here we have a wartime sketch of Marietta, and we can see the twin peaks of Big and Little Kennesaw just west of the town. Well, if you're Joseph Johnston, this is excellent defensive terrain. You have two mountain peaks with other rocky hillsides around them that are right next to the rail line that Sherman absolutely needs. So this is good defensive ground if you're Joseph Johnston. This is a great time to slam the brakes on this campaign, slow things down, and test Sherman's patience, perseverance, and willpower to continue on. Now this is a very famous photograph taken after the fighting around Kennesaw, but it shows some of the trenches around the mountain that compose what many historians called the Kennesaw Line. For Union and Confederate forces, starting on June 19, 1864, these two armies are going to settle in around Kennesaw Mountain, and a daily grind of skirmishing every day, picket firing every day, the threat of death from artillery shells or a sniper's bullet every day will commence. This is the view from Kennesaw Mountain itself. It's about 700 feet high, about 1,800 feet above sea level. You can see a lot of the ground of the Atlanta campaign here. It's just a beautiful view. I just mostly threw this in there for the beautiful view. But back to this theme of stagnation and skirmishing. These are actually some replica earthworks that have been built right near Kennesaw Mountain at a place called Gilgal Church Battlefield. Some of the skirmishing fighting taking place around Kennesaw, one of the fights was at Gilgal Church. And it gives you an idea of what these soldiers are working with every day. These are logs stacked up 6 feet high. There are sometimes head logs on top providing a nice little window through which to fire at your opponent. But these are the trenches that soldiers will be occupying around the fighting around Kennesaw Mountain on this Kennesaw line. And during this fighting, it's taking a tremendous toll on soldiers of both sides. One soldier, a quartermaster in the 125th Illinois, wrote home to his wife in early June saying, "This is now the 35th day of this campaign, and we have advanced in the enemy's territory 108 miles. It's a slight exaggeration there, but we can't blame him for that. Constantly driving the enemy. There has been some pretty bad fighting and a good many men lost. We are now 32 miles from Atlanta. We may stay here a few days to let the troops rest, for they're almost all worn out. There may be some hard fighting before we get to Atlanta, but I think if we get there, we will stop for some time. On the opposite side of the campaign, a lieutenant colonel in the 43rd Mississippi who wrote his wife a series of very detailed, intricate letters during the Atlanta campaign. Through these letters, we see a picture not of soldiers who are demoralized, but soldiers who are still hoping for a chance to strike back against what they see as the enemy invader, the Yankee invader, who's on Southern soil. In early June, Lieutenant Colonel Columbus Sykes wrote, "The heroic fortitude, unflinching courage, and patient endurance of the men amid the dangers, toils, privations, hardships, midday and midnight marches of a campaign, which is now at the end of its 6th week, and will probably continue as much longer, is not only wonderful, but will excite admiration in the most stoical and unfeeling heart. It is said that General Johnston has said that this is the best and bravest army he ever saw." We have frustration growing on both sides, mostly on the side of William Tecumseh Sherman. He's many, many miles from his supply base. His supply lines are reaching all the way up into Nashville in Tennessee, and he realizes that he can't stay here forever. So he begins trying to, once again, outflank Joseph Johnston. Unfortunately for Sherman, he runs into a little problem, and that problem is named John Bell Hood. John Bell Hood was placed on the southern end of the Confederate line on June 22, 1864, in a defensive position. But much like here at Gettysburg, Hood decides he's taking an aggressive role that day. He's going to be attacking forward, and he attacks directly into Sherman's flanking attempt, and the Battle of Cobb's Farm is the result. Now there's, again, not an exorbitant amount of casualties that day, certainly not when compared to Gettysburg and Spotsylvania. There's about 1,500 Confederate casualties, maybe a few hundred Union casualties, but it's a very fierce fight. Here we have a map of Cobb's Farm, showing Hood's 2 divisions, Stevenson and Hidman, charging right into the Union 20th Corps, commanded by Joseph Hooker, another man from the Civil War's Eastern Theater. But what this does, more than on a tactical level, on a broader strategic level for the campaign for Kennesaw Mountain, is this sends a message to William Tecumseh Sherman. It tells Sherman that Johnston is defending his left flank. He has John Bell Hood down there on the left flank, making sure that no one can get around it. So for Sherman, perhaps moving around Johnston's position will not work this time. Perhaps he needs to take a different approach. 2 days later, on June 24th, 1864, Sherman orders an assault at Kennesaw Mountain in what is known as Special Orders 28. In the days leading up to that, he had been dispatching back and forth with the various generals in his army. And through these dispatches, it had become clear to Sherman that his own lines were very thin. They were very stretched out. And everywhere they were moving, they were meeting Confederates. So let's put ourselves in Sherman's shoes here. If we have more men than our opponent has, and our own lines are thin and stretched out, and everywhere we're going, we're meeting Confederates, that might suggest what? That might suggest that if you're Joseph Johnston, your lines are stretched incredibly thin. And perhaps they are so thin that there might be a vulnerability there. There might be a chance to break through. George Thomas wrote to Sherman on the morning of June 24th, the morning he issued his orders to attack. "The troops are much fatigued in consequence of the continuous operations of the last 3 or 4 days. Howard's and Palmer's fronts are now so much extended that it will be exceedingly difficult for them to mass a sufficient number of men to make an effective move." Sherman's response, somewhat sarcastic, "I suppose the enemy with his smaller force intends to surround us. But I propose to study the ground well, and the day after tomorrow break through, after letting Johnston develop his line as much as possible." And thus we have Special Orders 28, Sherman's decision to attack at Kennesaw Mountain, one of the most heavily criticized decisions of Sherman's military career. He orders 2 primary assaults. The secondary assault, we can call it, will take place with men of the Army of the Tennessee attacking against what is known as Pigeon Hill and Little Kennesaw Mountain. Little Kennesaw, the smaller of the 2 peaks at Kennesaw Mountain, and just south of Little Kennesaw is a very rocky hilltop known as Pigeon Hill. I have read that it is named Pigeon Hill because of pigeons stopping there on their migration patterns after the war. I don't know if that is true or not, but for those of you who are wondering where the name Pigeon Hill comes from, that is one possible answer. That is one attack which Sherman intends to launch. The main attack, however, is going to be south of there. I was speaking with a gentleman before the program who said that until he went to Kennesaw Mountain, he didn't realize that a lot of the fighting actually took place south of the mountain, which I think that's a very common perception. And thus, Sherman's main attack, it's not at the main mountain peak itself. It is actually a few miles south, where George Thomas and the Army of the Cumberland will amass about 12,000 men and send them directly towards Confederate lines, trying to punch through what Sherman hopes is a thin and weakened Confederate front. Why does he do it? It's a question historians and veterans of the assault have been asking ever since it was made. One answer is frustration. He's mad. He's tired of this stalemate around Kennesaw. He wants to continue on to Atlanta. Another answer, worries over supply lines. Sherman's dispatches at that time were filled with concerns over how much his men were going to get to eat, how he was going to continue bringing supplies all the way down that rail line towards his armies. And of course, the obvious answer would be he simply wants to end the campaign. He's hoping to break through Johnston's lines, perhaps overwhelm the Confederate army, and force an end to the campaign before he even gets to Atlanta. On June 26th, the day before the battle, Sherman provided some insight into his decision-making in a letter he wrote home to his wife. We have worked our way forward until we are in close contact, constant skirmishing and picket firing. Johnston is afraid to come at us, and we have been cautious and dashing against his breastworks that are so difficult to understand in this hilly and wooded country. My lines are 10 miles long, and every change necessitates a larger amount of work. Still, we are now all ready, and I must attack directly or turn the position. Both will be attended with loss and difficulty, but one or the other must be attempted. In the coming days, there will be preparations for battle around Kennesaw Mountain. Many soldiers in the Union Army were kept in the dark. They were not told of the plan to attack immediately. The idea was that secrecy was the key to this assault. But nonetheless, men began to have a sense that there was an impending battle. Private John Swanson from Illinois wrote in his diary that a big battle is unquestionably at hand. This afternoon, there was another furious cannonade. One Alabama soldier, William McMillan, wrote in his diary, "We are well entrenched now and have plenty loose rocks, and I think it would take more Yankees than you could pack into a 50-acre field to move us from our position." He went on to write that the sight of these Union soldiers made him very angry, as he saw them as destroying our beautiful fields and the peaceful homes of our countrymen, and it takes something from the beauty of the scene. Well, this feeling that there was an impending assault taking place, it wasn't only in the men in the ranks. None other than General Hardee himself, one of the corps commanders in Johnston's army, wrote home on June 26th, the day before this attack was to take place. "My lines are strong, and I feel perfectly confident of whipping the Yankees whenever and howsoever they come." Years after the battle, Sergeant Stuart Nixon of the 52nd Ohio recalled the evening before the assault, writing, "There was such a beautiful sunset that evening. The trees and woods seemed touched and set on fire. I had thought of the burning bush, but it had come back to me as one of the loveliest pictures of memory. Jest and laughter was heard from the groups gathered here and there to while away the time, while nothing seemed to disturb the steady stroke of an easygoing heart." I thought before we talked about the battle specifically, we could hear some words on Kennesaw Mountain from a man who certainly had a major role to play here at the Battle of Gettysburg. While I've been working on a project on Kennesaw Mountain over the past months, I've been working at Antietam or working at Gettysburg, and well, Oliver O. Howard was the only man who was at Antietam, at Gettysburg, and Kennesaw, so he was kind of a nice way for me to keep my sanity while working on 3 different campaigns. But Howard had some things to say on Kennesaw Mountain, comparing it to the action that took place here at Gettysburg. He wrote, "The whole line, the Kennesaw line, was stronger in artificial contrivances and natural features than the cemetery at Gettysburg," Cemetery Hill here. "The complete works, the slashings in front, and the difficulties of the slope toward us under the full sweep of crossfire made the position almost impregnable. For reasons similar to those which induced Lee to strike twice for Little Round Top, Sherman ordered an assault here with the hope of carrying the southern slope of Kennesaw or penetrating Johnston's long line at some weak point. Here we have a map showing the general assaults of June 27th, the day of Kennesaw Mountain. As you can see, there are to be some skirmishing attacks at Big Kennesaw, the main peak of the mountain. A secondary assault with John Logan's 15th Corps attacking against Little Kennesaw and Pigeon Hill. And the main assault, men from the Union Army of the Cumberland attacking against the center of the Confederate line. So let's begin to the north at Big Kennesaw Mountain. This is a very famous painting. It looks a little dark here, but it's a very famous painting showing the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. And of course you can see quite prominently Big Kennesaw, the main peak there. Now why, you might ask, is there skirmishing there at all? Why not just reserve all the men for the main attacks? Well, if you're William Tecumseh Sherman or James McPherson, commander of the Army of the Tennessee, you might want to send skirmishers against Big Kennesaw. Number one, believing that perhaps the line was so weak there that they might be able to take the summit. Perhaps Johnston believed that the terrain there was so strong that he didn't really need to place that many men there. Another reason is you want to distract Johnston. You want to prevent him from allocating his resources to block the main assaults. So on the morning of June 27th at 8 a.m., a furious cannonade begins with Union gunners blasting Confederates across the Kennesaw line. Several hundred skirmishers from various Union regiments begin scampering up the slopes of Big Kennesaw. There's going to be about 400 combined Union casualties on Kennesaw Mountain out of the few thousand men who were sent in the skirmishing attacks there. But the main assault for the Army of the Tennessee, what we can call the secondary assault overall, takes place at Pigeon Hill and Little Kennesaw. Now this is a photograph on top of Little Kennesaw Mountain. There were Confederate artillery pieces up there, much to the credit of the strong Confederate gunners who pulled them up there. It certainly wasn't an easy feat. The fighting at Little Kennesaw and Pigeon Hill. Roughly 5,500 Union soldiers attacking against about 11,000 Confederates. And these are 11,000 Confederates who have trenches, who've had several days to prepare these trenches. And they're on top of rocky hillsides and wooded slopes. So certainly this is a very difficult task. As Captain Alva Skilton of the 57th Ohio wrote, this column has been selected as a forlorn hope, and we are expected to carry the enemy's works in our front. That morning before going into battle, Captain Jacob Augustin of the 55th Illinois wrote in his diary of his skepticism about the assault. Our division takes the lead. Now may God protect the right. Am doubting our success. Well, as these Union soldiers began trying to scamper up the slopes of Little Kennesaw and Pigeon Hill, there were 3 attacking brigades in this assault. Giles Smith, Joseph Lightburn, and Charles Walcott. Again, about 5,500 Union soldiers. And the ground they're attacking against, just to give you a sense of it, these are some of the lines held by the Confederates. This is one of the trench lines that you can still see today on top of Pigeon Hill. It still looks like a strong defensive position 150 years later, because it was. Private Joseph Gresham of the 83rd Ohio. The steeps of the mountain slopes were so rough and encumbered with huge rocks that we found it impossible to ascend far up under such a galling fire as they continued to pour into us. The scene of this day's fight beggars all description. The ground all around the mountain is exceedingly rough. Deep ravines, steep hills, sloughs, open fields, and thickets are intermingled together in indescribable confusion. Over such and all of these we had to charge, so that it was difficult to tell our position or see from what quarter danger threatened us the most. Many of these trenches atop Pigeon Hill were held by the brigade of Francis Cockrell. These are Missouri soldiers. Now, interestingly enough, some of the Union soldiers attacking against this position were also from the state of Missouri. So here, this is one example in the Civil War where we have men from the same state on 2 separate sides fighting against one another. Among those Missourians who sided with the South, with the Confederacy, was Lieutenant Joseph Boyce of the 1st and 4th Missouri. Atop Pigeon Hill, firing down into the ranks of men from his state, He later wrote, "It was really sickening to see those brave fellows struggling up that valley. Our infantry did not return their rammers as usual after loading, but stuck them in the ground and snatched them up when wanted, to save time. No troops could stand long such a concentrated fire." Opposite of Francis Cockrell, we have another picture here. That is Colonel Americus Rice of the 57th Ohio. Now, earlier that day, before the attack, Rice was one of several officers who was called to his brigade commander's headquarters to receive his orders for the attack. And he received a sort of pep talk there at the headquarters. One of those present later remarked that, well, several of those at the meeting would end up being killed or wounded on the slopes of Little Kennesaw and Pigeon Hill. One of those was Americus Rice. He received several wounds, one of them a severe wound in his right leg, which actually was near a wound he had received at Vicksburg 1 year before. When he was taken back to a field hospital, it was decided that the wound necessitated an amputation. And during that surgery, he actually woke up and had to deal with the pain of overcoming that. But in perhaps what is, in my opinion, the more important part of that story, he didn't stop serving his country. He ran for Congress, served in Congress in the 1870s. He could have said, "I did my part, and that's that. I suffered all of this pain and all of these horrible things," but he kept on. He continued on. He served as a Democrat from Ohio in the 1870s, and I believe he lived into the 20th century as well. By 10 a.m., this attack at Pigeon Hill had largely fallen out. Many of these soldiers were unable to gain their objectives that day. They had no choice but to fall back down the steep slopes of Little Kennesaw and Pigeon Hill. In this attack, there were nearly 600 casualties in 2 hours. 600 casualties spread over 3 brigades. That's roughly 200 casualties per brigade. That's about what the Irish Brigade lost at Gettysburg on July 2nd. In his report, one of Confederate officers who was there at Little Kennesaw wrote, "In less than 2 hours, the enemy was repulsed with great slaughter along our entire front and retreated in confusion, leaving a number of prisoners and many dead and wounded on the field." Again, just to give you a sense, the main assault, which is taking place at this same time, occurs a little ways to the south. And that occurs at a place known today as Cheatham Hill. Now, it was not known as Cheatham Hill before the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. It is known as Cheatham Hill for one of the most famous Confederate officers in the Western theater of the Civil War, Benjamin Franklin Cheatham. Cheatham's division of Hardee's Corps held this position along the Confederate line, as did the division of Patrick Cleburne, another very famous Confederate officer in the Western theater of the Civil War. And again, this was the largest Federal assault, the fiercest fighting at Kennesaw Mountain. There will be 5 Federal brigades from the 4th and the 14th Corps sent forward against this position. Here we have the 5 Federal brigades. And these Confederates at Cheatham Hill, they didn't have the advantage of steep slopes. Certainly it's a hill, but it's nothing when compared to Big Kennesaw, Little Kennesaw, and Pigeon Hill. They don't have the advantage of steep slopes and rocks. What they do have are very strong trenches and very strong impediments that they have built. They have cut down trees, saplings, sharpened them together, wired them together, and formed a dense mass of thickets and spikes, the likes of which these Union soldiers do not want to be going through. One Arkansas soldier, William Barnes, later wrote, "We had cut down and placed in our front hundreds of blackjack saplings as abattis, cutting off the tips of the limbs with our jackknives and whittling them so sharp and close it would have been an uphill business for even a rabbit to crawl through." Again, this is just a view of some of the earthworks along Cheatham and Cleburne's position. These are still preserved today at Kennesaw Mountain. They're some of the best preserved Civil War earthworks at any battlefield in the country. Forming for the assault, many of these men gathered up on hillsides opposite of the position. A large cannonade preceded the assault. There were nerves on men in both sides. Here we have some of the cannons placed along Patrick Cleburne's front. The 4th Corps assault. You can see down here there's a quote, it kind of cut off here, "To death or a southern prison." Those are the words of Private Jacob Andervount of the 19th Ohio, as he wrote in his diary of the attack that day. Now, the 19th Ohio wasn't sent forward. They were a reserve unit kept in readiness to be sent forward should they be needed. But nonetheless, this private is standing there watching men streaming back from this assault, noting that they had charged forward that day towards either death or a Southern prison with how strong the Confederate defenses were. Now, this attack starts shortly before 9 a.m. Doesn't start quite as early as the fighting to the north at Little Kennesaw and Pigeon Hill. In the moments before the attack began, there was a reporter from the Cincinnati Daily Commercial who was with some of the Union soldiers. And he wrote, "During the brief respite that ensued before the word charge was given, the men rested silently in their places, and no one could have guessed from their undisturbed faces that all the latent gallantry of their natures could be aroused and lashed into a fury of heroism during the next 10 minutes. Private Barnes, who we heard from just a few minutes ago in the 1st Arkansas, recalled of the moment when the attack began, seeing the Union soldiers coming into the Confederate line of fire. If any command was ever given for us to commence firing, I never heard it. It sounded as though we had 100 cannon instead of 8 or 10. And such regularity one would think they were on parade drill, scattering canister, grape, shrapnel, and short-fire bombs and the like, our infantry shot for execution. While the Yanks got as far as the gully in the ravine, which seemed at that time the healthiest place, one would imagine Vesuvius had moved over to the Confederate States of America and opened up business on Kennesaw Mountain. Amongst those Union soldiers running towards the Confederate lines was Henry Gilman Shedd of the 97th Ohio, who wrote, "The bullets, grape and canister shot, flew amazingly thick and fast. It seemed almost impossible for any of us to escape." Captain Robert Davis Smith, on the staff of Patrick Cleburne, later wrote, "The slaughter was terrific as our troops literally mowed them down." One captain from Kentucky, the 3rd Kentucky, a Union regiment, took shelter under the parapet, the Confederate earthworks, with guns blazing away just inches from his head. He later wrote, "The concussions from the enemy's cannon nearly unjointed my neck, and the heat from them burnt my face." Among those soldiers who went forward against the Confederate line was Brigadier General Charles Harker, all of 28 years old, a graduate of West Point, a colonel in the 65th Ohio earlier in the war. Harker had been offered a spot on Oliver Howard's staff. He had actually been offered his chief of staff spot when Oliver Howard took command of the 4th Corps in the Army of the Cumberland, and he turned it down. And of course, Howard was upset that he wouldn't have Harker working with him that closely, but he respected his decision. He later wrote, "He had independence of character and uprightness of conduct." He also wrote of Harker, "Whenever anything difficult was to be done, anything that required pluck and energy, we called on Harker." Well, while this federal assault is failing, while it is lagging, while the men are starting to stop and retreat, Harker, riding a white horse, he had had horses shot out from under him 4 other times during the war, takes his hat on his hand, charges forward on his horse, and is just feet from the Confederate lines when he is felled by a bullet. It pierces his arm, enters into his torso. He's carried back from the lines, mortally wounded. He would die later that day. He had only received his brigadier general's commission, the letter with his commission in it, just 20 days before. One officer who was good friends with Harker later wrote, "He, the brave and pure-hearted, has gone to his rest. He was a noble sacrifice offered for the noblest of causes." While this fighting is taking place with the 4th Corps soldiers to the south, there is perhaps the most famous assault at Kennesaw Mountain, the fighting taking place around what is known today simply as the Dead Angle. Now, it's known this for various reasons. There was fierce fighting, a lot of death, a lot of suffering that occurred here. There was also a flaw with this position because the Confederate line on this salient here, on this ridge, was built on the natural crest of the hill, not the military crest. This meant that looking downhill, there was a blind spot. Not the entire, it didn't have an open field of fire the entire way, we might say. And this is where men of the 14th Corps, the brigades of John Mitchell and Colonel Daniel McCook, charged forward towards Confederate lines. Mitchell's brigade charged across a stream, a branch of the John Ward Creek, and up against the dead angle with several hundred casualties. But the more famous of these attacks is that of Dan McCook. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more here. This is the stream through which these Union soldiers pressed on their way up towards the angle. But before they began their assault that day, Dan McCook, this 29-year-old colonel, from a family known as the Fighting McCooks, because so many of their fathers, brothers, and cousins had served in the Union Army, the Fighting McCooks. Sounds like a high school mascot, doesn't it? Well, so many of them had served in the Army, they're a very noted family. Well, you have this 29-year-old colonel who before the war had been a law partner of William Tecumseh Sherman in Kansas. He was a very odd fellow to be in this position. Well, he did what very few other officers would do in such circumstances. He recited poetry. He recited a stanza from Horatius by Thomas Macaulay. Standing in front of his men with cannon shot echoing above their heads, the order to go forward into combat is going to be given any moment, and this guy's reciting a poem. Then out spake brave Horatius, the captain of the gate, to every man upon this earth death cometh soon or late. And how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods? One of the soldiers present called it a heathen refrain, but noted that it did a good job of stirring up their patriotic spirit, getting them ready to charge into battle. And no sooner had he spoken these words that the order to charge forward came. The men plunged down through a ravine, across the branch of the John Ward Creek, and uphill against the dead angle. Lieutenant Colonel James Langley in McCook's brigade wrote the following. A few minutes before 9, the command forward was given and responded to by the brave men of the brigade with the will and determination to succeed where success was possible. On and up the brave men rushed with their gallant leader at the head, until some of them reached the base of the enemy's parapet. Nothing daunted, they struggled to scale the works. In their efforts to do this, some were knocked down with stones and clubs hurled at them by the enemy. In the Confederate lines, one of the brigades was commanded by Alfred Vaughan, who later wrote, "Never did men charge into the very jaws of death with a firmer tread and a more determination than did the Federals to this attack." J.T. Holmes, a major in the 52nd Ohio, later compared this to men charging forward into a sleet storm, leaning forward as the bullets were flying into them. Now, that to me sounds familiar to some of the Confederate accounts describing Pickett's charge. Lieutenant William Trask, a Louisianan, later wrote, "They advanced with a gallantry worthier of a better cause." Once they got up to the angle itself, an onslaught of shot and shell is pouring into their ranks. One of the Confederates at the angle is Private Sam Watkins, very famous veteran of the war. He wrote one of the most famous accounts of the war, Company H, an account of his time in the 1st Tennessee Infantry, which was positioned at the exact point of this salient at the dead angle, looking down the hill towards the attacking Union soldiers. This photograph is actually taken from what is the Illinois Monument at Kennesaw Battlefield, dedicated in 1914, 100 years ago this year, 50 years after the battle. Looking back on the fighting that day, Watkins wrote the following. "It seemed impossible to check the onslaught, but every man was true to his trust and seemed to think that at that moment the whole responsibility of the entire Confederate government was rested upon his shoulders. Talk about other battles, victories, shouts, cheers, and triumphs, but in comparison with this day's fight, all others dwarf into insignificance." Watkins went on to write that he had heard men talk after battles that they weren't sure if they killed a man in that fight. But this was never a doubt for any of the Confederates who were at the dead angle. No doubt it was a bit of an exaggeration when Watkins wrote that each man in his regiment killed from 20 to 100 Yankees, but it tells us of the certainty these men had, firing into direct targets advancing uphill against them, marching into what seemed to be a certain death. At the dead angle itself, we have two fallen officers. Here we have Dan McCook, who jumps on top of the parapet, putting his foot atop of the headlog in the Confederate trench, trying to shove it down, while bayonets are coming up at him. A musket is raised, fired directly into his chest as he falls backwards off the parapet. He would survive for several weeks. He died on July 17th, 1864, just 5 days short of his 30th birthday. And as soon as McCook falls, Colonel Oscar Harmon of the 125th Illinois, he takes command of the brigade, just moments before he is killed instantly by a wound to the head. Oscar Harmon had written a letter to his wife the day before, telling her that he was the most fortunate man in the world in having as good a wife as her. And he also wrote, "If I fall, expect me to fall in my proper place. Then no blame can be attached to me." By 10 a.m., it was fairly apparent that this assault had failed. At the dead angle, many of these Union soldiers fell back to the position roughly where this photograph was taken, not more than 50 yards away from the Confederate trenches. And they began to dig makeshift earthworks to protect themselves. It speaks to the soldiers' experience in 1864, that they knew right away they had to dig in, they had to protect themselves from this heavy fire coming directly at them. While these soldiers are doing this, trying to hang on, dispatches are being fired back and forth across the Federal lines, from one general to another, trying to inform Sherman of what is taking place. And by noon it had become apparent, by shortly after 1 o'clock it had become apparent to Sherman that this was not going as he had planned. Thomas told him several times of the heavy losses taking place in his brigades. Shortly after 2 o'clock, he reported to Sherman, "My officers report the enemy's works exceedingly strong, in fact so strong that they cannot be carried by assault, except by immense sacrifice, even if they can be carried at all." He went on writing, "We have already lost heavily today without gaining any material advantage. 1 or 2 more such assaults would use up this army." Sherman, of course, was dismayed by this. He still wanted Thomas to launch another assault, but by that evening he had accepted the realities of what took place that day. He compared it to the fighting taking place in the East, in Virginia, noting that the casualties were not as high as those that were occurring in the East. On the night of the 27th, reflecting on the day, Joseph Johnston, on the Confederate side, sent a dispatch to Richmond, writing, "The enemy advanced upon our whole line today. Their loss is supposed to be great. Ours is known to be small." Well, while these dispatches are going back and forth, and we understand things from the commanding general's perspective, what about the perspective of these men who made the assault? What is going on for the human cost of this attack at Kennesaw Mountain? Well, we can see it clearly in the words of Claiborne Walton, a surgeon, a Union surgeon, who day after day, night after night, was dealing with the consequences of war. He wrote home to his wife on June 29th, "I am sick, yes, sick and tired of bloodshed, weary and worn out with it. We have been on this campaign 56 days, and it has been almost one continued scene of carnage from one day to another. I am not out much of the groans of the wounded from morning till night. My hands are constantly steeped in blood." He went on writing, "The horror of this war can never be half told. Citizens at home can never know 1/4 part of the misery brought about by this terrible rebellion." Across the battlefield there was death and suffering. This is a famous sketch of a truce along the line during the fighting on the 27th. In front of Patrick Claiborne's division, some of these Confederate guns that had been belching forth the shot and shell, flames coming from their muzzles, actually set fire to some of the wooden earthworks. Well, for the wounded Federal soldiers, they were trapped in this inferno. And in a moment of humanity, Colonel William Martin of the 1st and 15th Arkansas raised a white flag, stood atop the parapet, and shouted, "Boys, this is butchery." He actually called a halt so that they could drag these wounded and dying men out of the way of these flames. It's a rare moment of humanity in what was a very inhumane attack that day. Across the lines, this was noted as a very severe assault. Men were left out in the heat that day. It was perhaps 100 degrees that day by many different accounts. These soldiers were exposed to the heat, the sunshine, the humidity, and the shot and shell of Confederate guns. And this also speaks to, again, the experience of soldiers in combat in 1864. I believe a few weeks ago, my colleague John Hoptak spoke about the Battle of the Crater in the Petersburg campaign. Well, what happened there was Union soldiers were digging a trench under Confederate lines, and they were going to set off an explosion to blast a hole in the Confederate position, which they eventually did. Well, here along the Kennesaw line, In the days after the attack, when there are soldiers still pinned down, some of them in makeshift trenches near the Confederate position, wouldn't you know it, but some of the soldiers get the same idea. And this is not coming from Sherman, this is not coming from Thomas, it's coming from lower in the ranks. Men are trying to dig a hole under the Confederate lines. Part of that hole still exists today. They were going to tunnel underneath, and the plan was by the 4th of July, they were going to set it off and give the Confederates an old-fashioned 4th of July celebration. That's how one Ohioan described it. Well, they're digging this trench for several days. By July 3rd, they were within 20 feet of the Confederate position. And on the morning of July 3rd, Union soldiers awoke and peered out from their lines only to see that the Confederates had vacated their trenches. Well, what's going on with this? Well, while these soldiers were pinned down on the Kennesaw line, while they were still suffering the effects of the charge at Kennesaw Mountain, Sherman was not dismayed by the results that day. Instead, he decided to go back to his previous pattern. He was determined to, at this point, separate from the railroad once again, believing that the lesser of two evils when compared to launching attacks such as that of the 27th. He was prepared to gather supplies, break away from the railroad, and swing entirely around Johnston's position, hoping to reach the Chattahoochee River if possible. Well, Johnston and his men, they picked up on this on July 2nd, and Johnston ordered another retreat in the face of Sherman's army. He decided to fall back from this exceedingly strong Kennesaw Mountain position, and thus we have a return to flanking. Several days after the battle, Johnston had left Kennesaw, and Sherman was once again pushing his way closer to Atlanta. By July 7th and 8th, Johnston had taken position on the last geographic barrier between the Federals and Atlanta, and that is the Chattahoochee River, just north of Atlanta. On July 9th, Johnston decided he was going to fall back because Sherman had crossed men both upstream and downstream from his position. He had no choice but to fall back from the river once again. Here we have Union soldiers crossing over the Chattahoochee. For some of these men, this is the first time to have a chance to bathe in several weeks. They had been engaged in the deadly combat of the hellhole in Georgia, the fighting and skirmishing, the daily killing along the Kennesaw line, and then the heat, grime, sweat, and bloodshed of battle at Kennesaw Mountain itself. Sherman actually, according to one account, got in the river and bathed with some of his soldiers. By mid-July, Sherman had zeroed in on Atlanta, encircling the city. Because of his patterns of retreat, Joseph Johnston was relieved of his command by Jefferson Davis, and none other than John Bell Hood took his place. Hood launched several fierce assaults against Union forces around the city, but they were not successful. On September 2nd, Sherman captured the city of Atlanta. Hood moved north into northern Georgia, hoping to lure Sherman to follow him, which he did for a while. He obliged him for a short while, until Sherman decided to set his sights south once again and launch his very famous, or infamous, depending on where you grew up, March to the Sea. And here we have a sketch of Sherman and his men marching triumphantly in Savannah in late 1864. Again, I'm sure for many of you, Sherman's March to the Sea has always been his most famous, or his biggest claim to fame. But we are left with a question: what role did Kennesaw Mountain have in all this? We have the fall of Atlanta, this tremendously important event, the March to the Sea, but we have this small fight, relatively small fight, at Kennesaw Mountain on June 27th, 1864. And it's a weird story because Kennesaw Mountain was, without a doubt, a Confederate victory. Union forces completely failed to meet their objectives that day. They suffered over 3,000 casualties. Johnston suffered just a few hundred. And yet it's a Confederate victory in the midst of this broader campaign. So how do we make sense of this? This is a question I've asked myself many times. Well, for the Confederate side, Kennesaw Mountain was Johnston's last best chance to stop Sherman's army. It was a strong geographic barrier. It was a good defensive position. On the same day of the battle at Kennesaw Mountain, Johnston sent a dispatch to Braxton Bragg in Richmond. I have been unable so far to stop the enemy's progress by gradual approaches on account of his numerous army and the character of the country, which is favorable to his method. Our best mode of operating against him would be to use strong parties of cavalry to cut his railroad communications. Our own cavalry is so weak compared with that of the Federal Army that I have been unable to do it. If you can employ cavalry in that way quickly, great benefit must result from it, probably Sherman's speedy discomfiture. Now, what Johnston was saying was, I'm probably not going to be able to stop him at this point. He's 30 miles from Atlanta, or under 30 miles from Atlanta. So there's not much more that I can do. I need help from Richmond. I need help from elsewhere to attack these long exposed supply lines along this railroad to stop the Federal advance. Well, from Richmond's perspective, they did not have help to give. The Confederacy was stretched thin. And certainly Johnston and Davis's poor working relationship was not going to help anything either. Josiah Gorgas, the chief of ordnance in Richmond, wrote in his diary a few days after Kennesaw, "No striking military events have occurred if we accept that Johnston telegraphs he repulsed a general attack of the enemy with supposed heavy losses. There are no particulars, and I have little confidence in the state of affairs in that quarter." Thus, for the Confederates, this was a Confederate victory, yet Sherman's presence needed more to repulse the Federal Army from being that close to Atlanta. Perhaps we might say it's too little too late for Johnston. What's clear is that there were rewards of victory for Johnston, but he and his army, for various reasons, were unable to seize those rewards and thus watched as they withered on the vine instead. So for the Confederates, we might say that Kennesaw Mountain is an episode of tragedy because it is a Confederate victory, yet it does not lead to a strong counteroffensive. It's not a battle such as Seven Pines in 1862, which completely stops a Federal advance and gives an opportunity for a Confederate counterattack. Instead, it's simply a temporary stop to the Federal advance. On the Union side, what did this mean for Sherman and his army? Well, without a doubt, this is a mistake for Sherman. This is not his finest hour, and historians ever since have noted that with many, many words. It was a mistake to attack at Kennesaw Mountain. He had his reasons to make the attack. It was a failure in many ways. In a June 30th letter to his wife, Sherman wrote, "It is enough to make the whole world start at the awful amount of death and destruction that now stalks abroad. Daily, for the past 2 months, has the work progressed, and I see no signs of a remission till one or both and all the armies are destroyed, when I suppose the balance of the people will tear each other up. I begin to regard the death and mangling of a couple thousand men as a small affair, a kind of morning dash, and it may well be that we become so hardened. Each day has killed or wounded some valuable officers and men, the bullets coming from a concealed foe." For Sherman, Kennesaw Mountain was a failure. It was a failure that taught him the folly of frontal attacks. Never again would he launch such a frontal assault. Instead, he decided rather than attacking fortified Confederate lines, he would attack the heart of the Confederacy itself. Atlanta, rail lines, factories, things that did not cost such a heavy price for his own men. And certainly we can say that Sherman was a man who had failed before. Perhaps we can say there were few other officers in the Civil War who were better prepared than Sherman to deal with failure. This is a man who had failed in his personal life. He had failed in his professional life. He had failed in his military life. In late 1861, he was called insane by a major newspaper in Cincinnati. And many a lesser man would have simply given up. But not Sherman. He was good at finding ways to overcome these difficulties. That is what he did after Kennesaw Mountain. And lastly, we have the cost of Kennesaw Mountain. Now, what I've tried to do here today is draw a few parallels between what I'm sure many of you are more familiar with, the fighting in the Eastern Theater, the fighting here at Gettysburg, and some of what occurred out west at places such as Kennesaw Mountain. Because while we're talking about a battle that took place many miles away in Georgia in 1864, there are many similarities. There are many common themes about the experience of war. The experience of these common men called to do extraordinary things in very difficult circumstances. We have here a photograph of 3 soldiers in the 1st Tennessee, 3 brothers. James Brandon, here on the left, Edmund Brandon, Alexander Brandon, and there was a 4th brother, Charles Brandon, who was captured during Pickett's charge here at Gettysburg. When thinking of such losses, the words of Walter Clark, a sergeant in the 26th Georgia, might come to mind, who upon calling the roll of his regiment on the night of June 27th, wrote, "Standing beside the breastworks on that summer evening under the shadow of the grim and silent Kennesaw, with twilight deeping into night, there were shadows on all our hearts as well, shadows that stretched beyond us and fell on hearts and hearthstones far away, shadows that rest there still and never lifted." Here we have a marker for Sergeant Coffey, Copernicus Coffey, killed on June 27th. Well, his mother did not receive a letter telling her of her son's death until August, in early August, when these two armies were settled outside of Atlanta in siege warfare. The sergeant wrote home to the mother telling her, "You are his mother, and I know how fondly you loved him. Your son Copernicus was killed June 27, 1864, cast in the assault on the rebel works. He fell like a brave soldier, gallantly fighting in defense of his country and for the most sacred rights of man." Copernicus Coffey was buried at the Marietta National Cemetery, which is the resting place for near 10,000 Union soldiers who died during the Atlanta campaign, many of them who died at Kennesaw Mountain and on the Kennesaw line. And in closing, I've come across many different quotes describing the fighting at Kennesaw Mountain and the sacrifices of these soldiers, but no quote has stood out for me as much as this from Lieutenant George Hurlbut, the 14th Battery of Ohio Light Infantry, who wrote home to his wife in early July telling her of the sacrifices that had been made thus far in the campaign. "Need I tell you that we are a weary, jaded, yet confident army? For 4 long weeks we have been within the sound of cannon and musketry, and the end is not yet near. In all history, there is nothing that will compare with this campaign of General Sherman's. Here we are 125 miles away from our base of supplies. I dare not contemplate what would be the result should the enemy destroy the railroad in our rear, over which comes the food for both men and horses. But I must not dream of anything but victory. It is certain that we have been thus far successful, driving an immense army before us through their own country. Our losses have been severe. Many brave men have fallen in battle, and many have died from disease. They have fallen in defense of principles that will never die." And lastly, to close with one more Gettysburg connection for you, in case you're not tired of it yet. There was one captain from the 52nd Ohio who years later was giving an address to some of his comrades, some of the fellow veterans of Kennesaw Mountain, who said, "The men of McCook's brigade claim that that day's work at Kennesaw entitles them to at least as much credit as has been accorded to George Pickett's men," of course, for Pickett's charge. "It may be considered by some too presuming to compare this and Pickett's charge, but we venture to think not." I want to thank everyone for coming out to Gettysburg today for the Winter Lecture Series. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to do my best to try to answer them for you. And again, on behalf of everyone here at Gettysburg, thank you.
Yeah. I still can't understand on June 26th and 27th why Sherman he knew that Hood had left the Confederate right flank and was down on the left. Maybe Wheeler was up there, a few of Loring's men. Why in the world didn't he go back to the railroad where he started to go after Dallas and New Hope Church and try to go around the north end of Kennesaw into Marietta and flank him that way and stay on his supply line?
Well, it's a good question. Why didn't Sherman try to go around to the north rather than the south? I haven't seen any conclusive thing where it's like, okay, well, that's why. I think in Sherman's mind, he doesn't want to risk the guns of Big Kennesaw. They make things difficult moving in that area. There is Confederate cavalry up there. His pattern of advance had been moving south and flanking Johnston to the south. There had been some heavy skirmishing up around there, places such as Noonday Creek, some heavy fights that perhaps had the similar effect on Sherman's thinking, as did the fighting at Cobb's Farm. There's really a variety of reasons. No one other than Sherman himself could answer that fully, but I would answer by saying a variety of reasons. Yeah.
The officer that turned down the position on Howard's staff, Parker,
Mm-hmm.
was that because he might have a better chance of advancement with a field command, or was it Howard's continuous religious fervor? Was that still a factor in perhaps distancing himself from his fellow officers?
I do not know. I do not know why he turned it down, other than everything I've read about him states that he would rather be at the front fighting.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know none of us like talking about failures in life. We like talking about our successes.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, later in life, did Sherman ever address this issue of the 27th?
He wrote about it in his memoirs. He had a paragraph on it. I think I have it somewhere in my notes. He doesn't talk about it too much. The same way Hood never really talks about Cobb's Farm, which a lot of people were really mad at Hood for that. Sherman never really talks about it in any great detail. He wrote years later that he conferred with Schofield, Thomas, and McPherson before making the attack, and everybody agreed that the lines were too spread out to do any more flanking. And he firmly believed that he had a chance to win. So it was more of a defensive, backing up what he did, explaining what he did. He may have addressed it in a few comments here or there, but his memoirs was the most substantive statement on it. Yeah.
At the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned the three most important battles: Fall and Land, Gettysburg, and Antietam.
Mm-hmm.
Still focusing on the South, how would you rank Vicksburg? Many historians feel that one of the most important strategic battles because it
Right.
the Confederacy in half.
Yeah, well, Vicksburg is right up there, certainly. From a strategic standpoint, it's as important as Gettysburg, if not more important than Gettysburg. Considering the moral effect on the country, Gettysburg being so close to the capitals, being the bigger battle in terms of casualties with the primary personalities, obviously it stands first and foremost in our remembrance of the war. But yeah, Vicksburg's certainly right up there in the same group.
Just one.
Yeah.
I think another thing that was very frustrating before the 27th was 2 weeks of incessant rain.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a nightmare.
Yeah.
He couldn't move, he was stuck in place.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that frustrated Sherman no end. He couldn't get his army on the go.
Yeah, this gentleman mentioned the heavy rain in June 1864, and one Union soldier wrote in his diary that the rain had caused the men to take the appearance not of Union soldiers, but of partly drowned rats. That's how much it was raining every day. Yes?
Do we know whether the Union was aware of how strong the breastworks and everything were up there?
That's a good question. I don't think they were. Certainly Johnston had time to work on them. He had a lot of time to work on them. But all the reports coming back on the 27th to Sherman, especially from Thomas, were, you know, hey, these are pretty strong earthworks here. The attack at the dead angle, that specific place was chosen because the scouting work or the preliminary work suggested that there were not obstructions. There were not saplings cut and things like that in front of the angle, which there were. They were just very close to the Confederate position. So, all right. Well, thank you all very much.